Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanishalaakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Mudirayet. In this session, we'll be discussing from verses 5, 6 and 7 of the 13th chapter of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. This chapter is entitled Dhritarashtra Quits Home. So the fifth verse, Pratyujagmu Praharshena Pranam Tanva Ivagatam Abhisangamya Vidivat Parishwanga Abhivadanaihi. The meaning of this verse is, with great delight they all approached him. Who is that him? Vidura. As if life had returned to their bodies. They exchanged obeisances and welcomed each other with embraces. Srila Prabhupada says in the purport, this is a continuation of the previous verse which describes Vidura arrived in Hastinapura and he was greeted by so many of the residents of the palace headed by the Pandavas. So, how did they feel? That's what is being described here. In the absence of consciousness, the limbs of the body remain inactive. But when consciousness returns, the limbs and senses become active and existence itself becomes delightful. Vidura was so dear to the members of the Kaurava family that his long absence from the palace was comparable to inactivity. Why was Vidura absent for a long time from the palace? If you remember, it was described previously that Vidura was insulted by Duryodhana when Vidura was trying to advise Dhritarashtra, his elder brother, in some particular issue, particularly Dhritarashtra not treating the Pandavas properly, while the Pandavas were actually without their fatherless children, and Dhritarashtra was a caretaker, but he was not properly treating the Pandavas. He was partial to his own sons and he did so much injustice to the Pandavas. And therefore, when Vidura pointed that out to Dhritarashtra, Duryodhana became very angry and he insulted Vidura. Of course, Vidura apparently left the palace being insulted by Duryodhana. But in reality, Vidura left the palace because he wanted to inquire about the spiritual subject matter from saintly persons in the places of pilgrimage. Therefore, Vidura left the palace in order to visit holy places of pilgrimage to search out for a saintly person who could explain to him the truth about the self, Atma Vidya or Brahma Vidya. This is actually the real business of human form of life, to make this inquiry. In the Vedanta Sutra it is said, Athato Brahma Jignasa. So Vidura actually left the palace not because he was insulted by Duryodhana, but really because he wanted to inquire and acquire the knowledge about the self, Atma Vidya. So Vidura left and went on a pilgrimage, and he kept traveling till he met Uddhava. in one of the holy places of pilgrimage. And he began to inquire from Uddhava about the self. While Uddhava began to speak, then Uddhava realized that Vidura's questions can best be answered by Maitreya Rishi, because even though both Uddhava and Maitreya Rishi were instructed by Krishna before Krishna's departure from this world at the end of his manifest pastimes, even though both were instructed and both were self-realized, both were competent, but Maitreya Rishi was elder in age to Uddhava. Therefore, Uddhava did not want to actually do Maryada Vetikrama. He didn't want to break the Vaishnava etiquette, that when there is a senior devotee or senior personality present, then the younger one should not instruct the seekers of knowledge, spiritual knowledge. So Uddhava directed Vidura to go to Maitreya Rishi, who was nearby, and inquire from Maitreya Rishi about this knowledge of the self, Atma Vidya. Accordingly, Vidura went to Maitreya Rishi, and Maitreya Rishi received Vidura very nicely and instructed him. So after Vidura was instructed by Maitreya Rishi, then he came back to Hastinapura. Why did he come back? To actually deliver his brother Dhritarashtra. By this time, already the battle of Kurukshetra was over, and all the Kauravas were killed in that battle. Dhritarashtra and Gandhari were staying under the care of Yudhishthira when Yudhishthira was enthroned as the emperor of the world after the battle of Kurukshetra by Lord Krishna. And Yudhishthira was ruling. Yudhishthira was very, very kind and respectful and compassionate, and very nicely he was taking care of Dhritarashtra and Gandhari, his uncle and aunt. He was taking care of them in the palace. They were living under the care of Yudhishthira very nicely. But Vidura actually thought that Dhritarashtra is actually not pursuing self-realization. He is just living comfortably in the palace under the care of Yudhishthira and wasting his time in simply maintaining the body simply for the sake of living a comfortable life. While time is running out, death is nearing. He had become an old man. Dhritarashtra had become an old man. So Vidura came back to the palace simply to deliver Dhritarashtra, because he himself, Vidura himself, was self-realized. So Vidura came back, and how the members of the royal palace received Vidura is being described here. Vidura was so dear to the members of the Kaurava family that his long absence from the palace is comparable to inactivity. All of them were feeling acute separation from Vidura, and therefore his return to the palace was joyful for all. The sixth verse, Mumuchu prema bashpaugham viraha outkanthya kataraha rajatam arhayam chakre kritasana parigraham. The meaning of this verse is, due to anxieties and long separation, they all cried out of affection. King Yudhishthira then arranged to offer sitting accommodations and a reception for Vidura. The seventh verse, Tam bhuktavantam vishrantam asinam sukham asane prashrayavanato raja prahatesham cha shrunvatam. The meaning of this seventh verse is, after Vidura ate sumptuously and took sufficient rest, he was comfortably seated. Then King Yudhishthira began to speak to him, and all who were present there listened. Since he has come back, they are very eager to hear from him about his travel. Now, in the purport, Srila Prabhupada explains something very important about the Vedic culture. Srila Prabhupada says, King Yudhishthira was expert in reception also, even in the case of his family members. Vidura was well received by all the family members by exchange of embraces and obeisances. The younger ones to Vidura, they paid obeisances to Vidura, and the equals they embraced. And out of affection for all those family members, Vidura himself, he embraced the affectionate family members. After that, bathing and arrangements for a sumptuous dinner were made by Yudhishthira, and then Vidura was given sufficient rest. After finishing his rest, Vidura was offered a comfortable place to sit, and then the king, Yudhishthira, began to talk about all happenings, both family and otherwise. That is the proper way to receive a beloved friend or even an enemy. This is the important point we should note. Srila Prabhupada says, not only receiving a friend properly, so nicely, or some dear relative, but even an enemy comes home, he should be received the same way like an affectionate relative or a dear friend. So Srila Prabhupada says, according to Indian moral codes, that is based on the Vedic culture, Vedic tradition, even an enemy received at home should be so well received that he will not feel any fearful situation. An enemy is always afraid of his enemy, but this should not be so when he is received at home by his enemy. This means that a person, when received at home, should be treated as a relative. So, what to speak of a family member like Vidura, who was a well-wisher for all the members of the family. Thus, Yudhishthira Maharaj began to speak in the presence of all the other members. Very lovingly, Yudhishthira began to speak to Vidura. Now, Srila Prabhupada explains elsewhere, what is this Vedic culture of receiving a guest, even if the guest means atithi, somebody who comes without being invited, not having an invitation. Obviously, enemy will not have an invitation. So, even if an enemy comes or anybody comes without invitation, they are received very nicely by being offered a reception that is supposed to be offered to atithi, a guest who is uninvited, who comes home. How should a householder receive such a guest? So, the injunction in the Vedas is that a householder griham shatrum api praptam vishwastam akuto abhayam. This is the Vedic injunction. Even an enemy enters your house, you will receive him in such a friendly way that he will forget that you are his enemy and he will have no fear of facing the enemy. That is the way to receive. So, Srila Prabhupada explains elsewhere that when Parikshit Maharaj went hunting on some occasion and he became very thirsty and he started looking for water, he could not find any body of water nearby in the forest, and he happened to come across the ashram of one Shamika Rishi. So he entered that ashram of Shamika Rishi, and the Rishi was sitting there, and Yudhishthira Maharaj was not properly welcomed and received by this Rishi. So, Parikshit Maharaj was not received properly by Rishi Shamika. So, Parikshit Maharaj became very angry at not being received properly. So, Srila Prabhupada explains, why did Parikshit Maharaj become angry at this Shamika Rishi? Actually, Parikshit Maharaj is a Kshatriya, is in a subordinate position to Shamika Rishi, because Shamika Rishi is a Brahmana. So it is not expected that a Brahmana should actually respect a Kshatriya in the normal circumstances. But in this particular case, when Parikshit Maharaj has come to the ashram as a guest, Atithi, then even if that Atithi happens to be an enemy, what to speak of a good Kshatriya king, the host, the resident of that ashram should receive the guest respectfully, very nicely, very properly. So, only because of this particular injunction in the scriptures, it was justified that Parikshit Maharaj became upset with Shamika Rishi. But then again, Shamika Rishi was not receiving properly Parikshit Maharaj, because Shamika Rishi was in meditation. So it's an extraordinary circumstance arranged by the Supreme Lord, so that Parikshit would be cursed by the son of Shamika Rishi, and Parikshit would retire from his kingdom, and later on Bhagavatam would be spoken by Shukadeva Goswami to Parikshit Maharaj. It will be revealed to the whole world through the medium of Shukadeva and Parikshit. That was Krishna's arrangement. In any case, this is what Prabhupada says, the Vedic culture is to receive any uninvited guest properly, even if the guest happens to be an enemy. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.